In the tradition of Malcolm X, peace be unto you. Recently, journalists and demographers have identified a trend in the African American community. They have called it reverse migration. Thousands of African Americans have started to migrate or move back into the southern states. And the causes for that are related to cost of living, as well as some folks have reached their retirement age and are looking to reunite with family members, which they maintain contact with over the decades since the migration out of the South into the North, which occurred beginning at the turn of the 20th century. Millions of African Americans sought a better environment in which to live and economic opportunities in the northeastern states and fewer in the western states. They were attracted by the war industries primarily, particularly World War I and World War II were opportunities for African Americans to access jobs that were not available in the South, as well as to escape the terrorism which had plagued African Americans since the end of the Civil War. Today, the African American population continues to be concentrated in the southern states. Approximately 53% of all African Americans live in the southern states. And so concentrations of African Americans in cities throughout the South give a sense of belongingness to African Americans. However, there are problems. This reverse migration is not without its difficulties, and some of those difficulties are very unique, and one is climate change. Many of you have been listening to the scientists, meteorologists, astrophysicists, and they have identified that globally, the average global temperature has been increasing. The average global temperature has risen over the past 10 years consistently, going back to the year 2000. And 16 of the last 17 years have been the hottest since 2000, since the year 2000. And of course, there are other side effects or collateral effects that result from this consistent increase in the average global temperature. In fact, it is stressing the environment in many unseen ways, but it's also affording an opportunity for some life forms, such as mosquitoes, to expand their habitat. Take, for example, the mosquito that spreads the Zika virus. That has become a problem in Puerto Rico, Florida, Texas, and there have been other cases, I think, in New Orleans, Louisiana, and in Southern California. Now, some of these cases are the result of immigrants coming into the United States from South America and the Caribbean islands. However, there are some cases that are unique to people who were born in the United States. And so increasingly, the Zika virus is going to be a problem in the southern states as temperatures increase. And the conditions for the mosquito that carries the Zika virus increase. And one of the results of the Zika virus infection is a terrible birth defect, microencephaly, children born with small heads, and of course, the resultant brain damage. Another mosquito carrying the West Nile Valley virus has been around now for over 15 years and has killed people in California as far north as Modesto. I am very familiar with a college instructor that died of West Nile Valley virus a couple of years ago. So if you look at a map and you look at the states and you see those that are most likely to be plagued with higher rates of infection, you'll see that the West Nile Valley virus has spread throughout the United States from New York to California. As global temperatures increase, that mosquito will find habitats in the United States that historically have not been conducive to their reproduction. And so we can expect an increase in the population of mosquitoes. I once lived in Mississippi when I was a young boy, and mosquitoes at certain times of the year are really problematic. Now, one of the other issues we have in relationship to other kinds of infections is that antibiotics are becoming less effective. And they're becoming less effective because many Americans are overusing antibiotics. And another issue or another side effect of the global warming is the melting of the polar ice caps. We know that the Arctic ice cap is predicted to be gone. Antarctica is also melting, and one of the results will be an increase in sea level. Now, this has happened before in the Earth's history, but not with 7.58 billion people living on the planet, and most of whom are living on coastal areas. It is expected that the sea level rise will affect Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, and all the coastal cities in the United States this century. Now, we're talking major inundation. Some scientists are predicting a sea level rise of 30 feet by the end of this century. Not long ago, Governor Jerry Brown announced that California will have to move its international airports in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Oakland inland because of sea level rise. And of course, many properties will be devalued as well because many were built on landfills. Now, New York, Manhattan, Harlem, all of these areas, Baltimore, all of those areas are going to suffer from the rise in sea level as well. And as a consequence, millions of African Americans, millions of people, but millions of descendants of slaves who are the poorest people in the United States are going to be displaced and have nowhere to go. We have to accept the social fact that we live in a racial caste system. No, it is not de jure. It is not by law anymore. However, it is de facto, and we see that when we look at the statistics that qualify our position in society in relation to others. Now, every environment has a carrying capacity, and there's a simple formula that we can all quickly understand, and it is simply that the capacity of any environment is equal to the ratio of biotic potential to environmental resistance. And that means even if it's a room, once you get too many people in that room, there is a tipping point beyond which that room and all of the conditions that make it up begins to resist any growth at any level, whether it be emotional, whether it be physical, etc. There's a logistical growth model which describes it. That growth model takes into consideration larger environments where water and food and air and living space, of course, are all values that animals compete for. Once that limit is reached, the environment is triggered to resist any future growth at the biotic level. And that's when we start to see social problems that are extreme as people increasingly compete for fewer and fewer resources. And all of these social collateral effects start to grow. Many experiments have been done. There's a famous experiment that was conducted many, many years ago with mice. And it demonstrated that even in an environment of plenty, once the population reaches a certain tipping point, bizarre behavior starts to arise among rat populations. Now, one other issue that you certainly don't want to forget is that if you move into the southern states, you're moving into the poorer states in the United States. All of the southern states, except for Texas, generally, are poor. Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana and Arkansas take the lead. We can throw Tennessee in there. Tennessee has some very, very poor areas, impoverished people. We're talking millions of impoverished people. And if you've ever been through Jackson, Mississippi, you understand that the carrying capacity, C equals the ratio of B to E, is in effect as you see people becoming more and more maladjusted, more and more socially unable to adapt to the greater demands to compete for fewer resources in that city alone. And that's going to be applicable to Atlanta, Georgia. That's going to be applicable to every major city on every coastal area and inland area in the South in the United States. My position is that if you are looking to raise a family in the southern states, you are looking in the wrong place. We have enumerated disease by Zika virus and other plagues that are going to occur in the southern states sooner than the northern states. Now, what's the history behind all of this? Well, in short, the Earth has gone through many cycles that involve extreme climatic change. But we are at the tail end of what scientists call a warming period. And that warming period began about, 15,000 years ago after the last glacial period reached its maximum level. And at that time, the glaciers literally in the northern and southern hemispheres of the planet were as high as 2 miles, 2-mile high chunks of ice covering the landscape. And our history, the history that we've been experiencing, has only been 7 or 8 or 9,000 years. And that's why we only have 5,000 or 6,000 years of so-called recorded history. Of course, all of history is not recorded because when the ice melted, as the glaciers retreated, it caused the sea levels to rise as high as 400 feet. There are many cultures and many civilizations that are under the water that are now being discovered. One other issue that we should all keep in mind is that as the glaciers melt, they pour billions of gallons of fresh water into the oceans. And that, in turn, has an effect on climate. And I'll explain that in a moment. Now, imagine Africa tropical. Imagine North Africa tropical with great lakes and beautiful green forests. That is, in fact, what Africa, North Africa, where the Sahara Desert is located, that's how it looked. If you were to go back in time, or I would say probably 15,000, 20,000 years ago, and you would find African people living there in pleasant cultures. Now, when the fresh water melted from the glaciers, it had a direct effect on what is called the Gulf Stream. Now, the Gulf Stream is a kind of oceanic circulation where you have hot water flowing not on the surface per se, but just beneath the surface of the ocean, and then it reaches a point such as the North Atlantic and it flips, and then it becomes cooler as it flows down. Now, the reason it becomes cooler and flows down is because ocean water, as you know, has a high concentration of salt. Now, as the fresh water from the glaciers melt into the ocean, it desalinizes the ocean, and that slows down the Gulf Stream. Now, natural cycles have resulted as a consequence of this process, because when that happens, when the Gulf Stream slows down, this oceanic current, it triggers an ice age. And so the ice age then, of course, draws in fresh water from the snow that falls due to increased precipitation that usually is the result of higher temperatures that then, of course, causes more rain to fall over the land. And then the rain flows to the ocean, and you have this natural cycle that takes place. So here we are at the same time that we have extreme temperatures rising throughout the planet and all the consequences that result from that, such as massive hurricanes and so forth. We also have the fresh water flowing into the North Atlantic as well as in the Southern Hemisphere from the Antarctica. And as a consequence, we have the desalinization of the ocean taking place at the same time. Now, another problem is that once we lose the ice, more sunlight enters into the ocean, heating it up even more. Because the ice in the past was the mechanism that reflected light back out into the atmosphere, thus preventing an overheating of the ocean, such that we would suffer social consequences. Now, civilizations have come and gone. It is most likely we'll never know all the great civilizations, such as the Indus Valley civilization, many civilizations off the coast of Japan and China that archaeologists are just now discovering because they were inundated by great tsunamis and by great tidal waves that resulted when the ocean sea levels went up. And that's why you got to be careful when you're studying history, because there's so much history we don't know. And when you have these conditions there, and I'm quoting here that the resulting biological annihilation obviously will have serious ecological, economic, and social consequences. Humanity will eventually pay a very high price for the decimation of the conditions that it has created, end quote. Now, you have a very short history, and that's like having a very short memory. And when you don't understand the nature of the cycles that recur and that have been recurring for over 1 billion years on this planet, and then you tamper with it by introducing increased burning of fossil fuels because of technologies that you knew would have a toxic effect on the environment, that includes us, then there's a price that's going to be paid, and we are there. It's not something that's coming. We are in the process now. We are in the beginning stages of seeing devastating side effects from this pollution, the burning of fossil fuels, methane that is now leaking back into the environment, out of the tundras and from the ocean floor, are adding to the warming effect. Why? Because methane is, I would say, 20 to 30% more or times more potent than carbon dioxide, meaning that the heating process is going to rise even faster. The situation is becoming so problematic globally that we're seeing people become more aggressive, more violent. They're fighting like rats in a cage for scarce resources. We see people on the move, leaving Africa, trying to move into Europe, leaving Africa, which many believe is the richest continent on earth, but you have to understand we're talking about rich minerally, not necessarily able to provide the amount of grains that are necessary to sustain the large numbers of people who are living there. And as a consequence, we see people on the move. And that's natural. It has happened many, many times, but it has happened on a planet that was scarcely populated by human beings 15 or 20,000 years ago. Well, we are moving toward 8 billion people on the planet. And within another 20 or 30 years, there's going to be 9 billion people on the planet, assuming that nothing intervenes in a catastrophic manner to bring that population down. And let me just say, it will. We saw what happened when Katrina occurred in New Orleans. That's a micro example of the devastation and the pain and the suffering and the death that is going to happen to people all over the world. What is the situation here for us? We have a serious problem because we, as descendants of slaves, we're the poorest people in the United States, aside from Native Americans. And right now, our prospect for surviving is not looking very high. And so what should we expect? Having a position at the bottom of the social pyramid in this caste system that we live in. Well, we should expect a further breakdown in family structures, a near complete individualization of lifestyle orientations, which we're seeing, and fewer children born. Those are all natural consequences of this kind of environmental resistance that arises once the tipping point is crossed. So these social problems, in many respects, are the result of this triggering of environmental resistance that occurs in very nuanced ways when the environment can no longer sustain us. Now, you may be watching the news and keeping your focus on the glaciers that are breaking off of Antarctica. And in 2010, there was a large ice shelf that broke off from Antarctica, and it's just floating away. And just recently, last year, a different ice shelf broke off from Antarctica and is floating away in the ocean. Now, we're talking millions of gallons of fresh water that slowly is melting into the oceans. And of course, in the southern hemisphere of the planet, that is causing a slowing down of the Gulf Stream that also winds its way, meanders its way through the southern hemisphere. And deforestation is an issue that we've been trying to address for decades. We see increased wildfires. We just had severe wildfires in California, Santa Rosa, Ventura County, the largest fires in the history of the United States. We see animals now that are endangered, amphibians, reptiles, birds dying. And of course, history demonstrates that the bubonic plague, for example, millions of people died as a result of a bacteria that was carried by a flea that rode on the back of a rat. And once the infection started to spread and people were ignorant at that time in human history, they did not even know bacteria existed. 1/3 of the population of Europe died, and of course, uncounted millions died in Africa as well, particularly in North Africa. And so you can see on the map the predicted areas where most of the damage will occur. And if you just draw a red line from Southern California all the way across to Georgia, anything below that red line is going to be a place where new life forms are going to invade, invasive species that once were contained in tropical areas such as Brazil, Central America. They're going to find a habitable place to live. And what are we doing? What are we doing? We are involved in frivolous activities. We are trying to vicariously participate in the illusion of entertainment success, whether it be sports or whether it be song and dance. And we are just not really acting intelligently, and we don't have the kind of leadership at all, which is forecasting these problems for us. Now, there's hundreds and hundreds of scientists that are doing it, but the information is not filtering down into the African American community, because if you listen to the preachers, if you listen to the so-called political leaders, they're not addressing this issue. And I can't claim to say that I've heard every lecture, every speech that these politicians are giving, but I haven't heard a single black politician or grassroots so-called spokesperson really seriously discuss the science of climate change. And I'm not talking about mythological nonsense. See, this is not an act of God. And if anybody tells you that, they're lying. Some of this is part of the natural cycles that our planet goes through. And some of it, of course, is because we're nasty and we're litter bugs. And we overuse resources in the environment because we're greedy and we've become decadent and we're selfish and we see no farther than the tip of our nose. And that makes us gullible. That makes us susceptible to mass manipulation and exploitation because we don't understand that more intelligent people use us as pawns on a chessboard, and they're amassing wealth that they're going to use to attempt to hold on a little longer as this planet breaks down, and it is breaking down. The planet we live on may not have the wherewithal to sustain us much longer. And some scientists, some expert scientists are predicting that it may be that within the next 10, 15 years, because of the breakdown in the food chain, we're going to be experiencing extinction, the sixth extinction. We're talking about 200 species a day going extinct. Now, when you reach levels of stress that high, poor people, powerless people, us, we are the ones who are going to be kicked down first. And you think people are selfish and unempathetic now. Wait until the food prices shoot sky high because the grains are not growing and the cattle can't eat and the meat prices soar and the chicken prices soar. And we already know that the fish have been adversely affected by the radiation poisoning that is the consequence of Fukushima and the meltdown of those nuclear reactors. See, what has happened to African Americans is that we have not only started a reverse migration to the South, but we have actually started to reverse intellectually, and we are moving into what used to be called historically the dark ages. We just relish in ignorance now. Our children are flunking out of schools. We have virtually no political representation. We have no political power. We claim not to have any wealth, but we can spend over $500 million to see a cartoon movie and claim, I spend more than that on coffee. Well, that's stupid too. If as a group, you're on the cut list, you're on nature's cut list as a human, as part of the human species, and you're on the cut list because you're at the bottom of the totem pole and you're going to be pushed out first. And the big rat is going to come after your cheese. And if you look at the new Foundation for American Greatness out of the Office of Management and Budget, and you look at the cuts that they're proposing, anybody that comes up to you and says to you, hey, let's ask the government for reparations, that's a carrot on the stick. They want something from you because you're not going to get reparations. You're not going to ever get reparations for slavery from the people that run this government. And you've got to understand that. That's a dead end. What we should be doing is collectively preparing for the disasters that are going to increase. Note I said increase. They're here. They're happening. And if you stick your head in the sand, that doesn't mean the wolf is going to go away. They're just going to have an easier time bringing you down. This is something that you will not be able to avoid. And this is something that you will not be able to expect help from your government to resolve. In fact, as you know, the Trump administration wants to cut food stamps. They want to increase the rent you're paying. And in low-income housing, HUD, which is headed by this very weird person, Ben Carson. And so it seems that we're not going to get it together and have a black bank with a concentration of wealth that can be used to address our collective issues. We had a bank, and the money was stolen. That's just Lincoln set it up. Lincoln funded it, and the people that were put in charge of it stole the money. Now, given our state of affairs now, I probably suspect that the thieves would take the money again, because pretty much most of the people propagating ideas to you right now, they have their hand out and they want your money. These people, these lowlifes, are actually just out there to live off of you. And so there's a lot of that kind of pathology in the black community. It's in the white community too. It's in the Asian community too. But I'm concerned right now with our state of affairs, and we are a very unhealthy community. And some folks are just going to be thieves, and they're going to hustle every kind of nickel and dime and ridiculous idea that they can. And the fact that we're failing in so many other areas in education, it means that our children are less able to think critically. Their reading skills are falling apart, and they're just gullible to every kind of ridiculous, stupid idea that's promoted. And you can see it for yourself on YouTube. It's like YouTube has allowed every fool with an idea to sell it to our folks. And it's not healthy, and it's going to get worse, because these are signs of desperation. Black people, intellectuals or semi-intellectuals, have become beggars. And it's really embarrassing. It's really tough to see. But expect that as the environment breaks down, the stress levels will increase, and we will see America humiliated as American citizens are humiliated, and we will see a breakdown in the moral fiber that remains in our society. And those of us who are perceptive can see it now, and it's going to increase. And so my advice to you is, if you have a family, do everything you can to keep your family intact and work together with your spouse as best you can with what you have. And you should be worried. You should have your head in both your hands, and you should be worried for yourself and for your children, especially if you're in the millennial or Generation X populations. And because you're going to see conditions that are unimaginable right now, and they're bad right now. And your children are going to see worst. So again, as I said in the beginning of this talk, if you're thinking about moving to the South, it is not a smart idea at all. You should put that in reverse. And if you don't believe me, take a trip to Jackson, Mississippi first. Take a trip to Atlanta and open your eyes and really see the conditions that African Americans are living in those cities. And, look at the stats first. Go there, drive, get in the car and go, and look at the stats, and then go there and see for yourself. It is going to get worse and worse and worse as we continue to deteriorate, and in part due to our own behavior. And don't look to the government, because the rich are getting their money together, and they're buying land in New Zealand. They are buying land all over the planet. They have bunkers, and they know, because they have the data and you don't. And they have the analysts they pay and you don't. And so that's the state of affairs at this time concerning the issue of reverse migration. And you should really put the brakes on that. We live in a vast, vast universe, and we really don't know where we are. We are on a planet, and we have our time clocks, and we have our spatial dimensions. But let me tell you something. Nobody on this planet knows where we really are. No one. And for all intents and purposes, we are alone. Now, that doesn't mean there's not other life forms, but we are alone. And you better hold those who are close to you tighter, because those are the folks that are going to be with you when the conditions become almost unbearable. I am Dr. Stephen Nur Ahmed. Peace be unto you.